Then?
Yeah, off we go.
Okay. So, hi everybody. We're still a bit distributed. Great to have the third years in place there, and there's quite a few people online as well. Conor asked me to introduce Seamus because I had told Seamus about these talks, but there's more reasons than that for doing it, really. Seamus did his final year project. Seamus is a Cork student, by the way, for those of you who don't know. And he did his final year project in 2006. And I had the pleasure of being a supervisor. And it was an absolutely outstandingly brilliant project. It might be one of the highest marks I've ever seen given for a final year project. And of course, you know, I was salivating at the thought of Seamus doing a PhD or whatever in Cork. But he had other ideas. So the old git. So he went to Cambridge to do a master's. And then went on to Chicago to do a PhD with Richard Schwader, who was somebody whose stuff I was reading and thinking he's great. And instead of just reading the stuff, Seamus went over to work with him. I think that's kind of what youth allows you to do, and but also just a bit of guts and a bit of ambition, which was absolutely brilliant to see in one of our students. But also at least a couple of us in the department, and Seamus will know who else, felt disappointed that he didn't think we were good enough to supervise his PhD. And we would have loved to have done it. But he did brilliant work in Chicago with Schwader and others. And I think Alex Gillespie was on your committee as well, wasn't he, Seamus?
That's right, yeah.
So, and for the third years, these are some of the biggest names in cultural psychology. And they were involved in supervising Seamus and working with him on his PhD and so on. So brilliant start. And for any of you in the room who were interested in doing research, a great role model. Brilliant final year project is the start. Then do a great master's in Cambridge and then find the best person in the world to supervise your research. And you have it sorted. Since then, he's had a whole ream of fellowships and grants. And is now associate professor in the University in Copenhagen. And if you heard us chatting earlier, has just got himself a big grant, which is amazing for somebody who's kind of early in their career and what have you. So well done again on that. And he's has built up a really strong reputation as a kind of a young researcher, kind of cutting away through the cultural psychology area, very often in really good applied fields like, you know, how people dealt with economic recession, protest, lack of protest, and so on. And he's going to talk to us today about some of that work, I think, but going to focus on field social psychology. And so without further ado, it is really a genuine pleasure to invite Seamus to talk to us about his work, and I really look forward to hearing it, Seamus.
Thanks so much, John. What a lovely introduction, and I spent my weekend just kind of reminiscing about my time in Cork. It's strange to think that it was 20 years ago in 2002 that I started, and as you said, you advised my final project, and obviously wrote me a very good letter to get me into Cambridge and to move on as well with my career. I've bounced around from Cork to Cambridge to Chicago, and then now back to Europe here in Copenhagen. So really, for all those third years listening, you're all in the right place. UCC Applied Psychology is the right place for you to be, and I'm sure people are very happy and doing very generative work and reading very interesting things. I remember, John, your lecture series on culture and cognition, and of course, Angela Thiel on the cultural nature of human development. And these are just, for me, really groundbreaking courses that I was reading these books and exposed to these ideas at such a young age. And each week I felt my repertoire expanding and how I think about the world. And really what I'm going to present today is just an outgrowth of some of those lectures and theorizing in culture and cognition and Angela's work as well. So thanks for having me back and for a very generous introduction. So today I'm going to talk about field social psychology. I think I've got about 25 minutes for this talk. So this is a paper my colleague Gabrielle Velez and I recently published in the American Psychologist just before Christmas. So there'll be 3 parts to the talk. In part 1, I want to introduce what Gabe and I wrote about under the title of Field Social Psychology by answering 3 interrelated questions. What is it? Why do we need it? And how do we do it? So this will be part 1, and the invitation here is to invite you into viewing psychology from a field social psychological perspective. And as John mentioned in his introduction, I've been doing empirical work in Ireland for nearly a decade now as well, into the economic recession from 2008 and why people didn't protest in Ireland, unlike some of the European Union neighbours, the Greeks, the Spanish, the Portuguese. The Italians, for example, protested against austerity measures when they were introduced following the financial collapse, but not in Ireland. But simultaneously, when the economy upturned in Ireland in 2014, then we had these mass protests and people taking to the streets when the new charge on water was introduced, which I'm sure some of you remember. So I did a lot of field work over a period of several years, mostly for my PhD when I was in Chicago. So I was coming back from Chicago to Ireland, and I'm going to present some of that work as an example of field social psychology. And then in part 3, I'm going to end relatively briefly by just talking about the potential of field social psychology to re-expand the paradigm of social psychology more generally. But I want to start by talking about field social psychology and start with a definition that Gabe Velez and I wrote in American Psychologist just recently. We describe field social psychology as a conceptual and methodological approach to describe, examine, and explain psychological phenomena at multiple levels of analysis, with emphasis on the socio-cultural environments in which people are embedded, the unfolding of psychological processes over time, and the use of ecologically valid multiple methods in conjunction. Of course, there's a lot here in this definition, but we think it really nicely encapsulates what we're trying to communicate with this proposition of field social psychology. And some of you who might be more familiar with the history of psychology, you might think of Kurt Lewin and his field theory that he developed in the 1920s and the 1930s. But when you read closely what Lewin was talking about in terms of field theory, he had this static ontology at the basis of what he was discussing. So this kind of philosophy of science that assumes that the world is given a priori, that it's not created, that it's not unfolded. Lewin had this idea that we can generalize our findings, and he had an overemphasis on experimental procedures. From these experimental procedures, when we're looking at how people thought, acted, or felt in context in the field, that we can generalize from this. So this, Lewin is kind of held up as being someone who made a lot of good progress with his articulation of field theory. But we had some differences with Lewin, as well as having some things in common. So when Gabe Velez and I articulated field social psychology, we had a process ontology at its basis, this kind of philosophy of science that sees the world as not just given, but unfolding and creating. And we need methodologies and ways to think about the unfolding nature of psychological and social phenomena. Rather than generalizing from experimental findings alone, our focus is on theorizing from local knowledge. So when we do local field work, which I'll talk about in the Irish context, how can we think more in a theoretical way, in a more global way from this local knowledge? And in contrast to Lewin, we emphasize ethnographic methods as being primary to field social psychology and experimental methods then in addition to this. So why do we need this rearticulation of field social psychology that Lewin at least attempted in some sense 100 years ago? So one reason is the replication crisis. And for me, my reading of the replication crisis is that it exposed within paradigm problems within mainstream social psychology. And more so, the responses to solving some of these problems and alleviating this crisis, they were useful, but also I felt that they were quite limited. Again, they were within paradigm solutions to within paradigm problems. And my overall reading of the replication crisis from about 2015, when it kind of broke, and these responses and debates around this, for me, just standing back a little bit as a Cork-educated cultural psychologist and looking in, it seemed that we're really looking at the limitations of experimental social psychology. And related to this, and I'm sure the students have heard about this, is the weird problem. So this is an over-reliance on and generalization from atypical samples, namely Western educated industrial weird and demographic samples, mostly American undergraduate students. And also related to the weird problem is the separation of researcher from sociocultural context that has been investigated. And for me, at least, this exposed the further limitations of experimental methods when used alone. So when it comes to why do we need field social psychology, my view is that we needed to expand the paradigm to overcome these well-documented limitations and to refocus social psychology and cultural psychology on experiences and meaning. This is something I learned as being central in John's culture and cognition classes on those Wednesday afternoons in Cork. We need field social psychology to holistically engage with cultural differences and to engage with processes as they unfold over time. And this is important, at least from my point of view and the argument we make in our field social psychology paper, to comprehend, so to document and describe, and then to orientate to, so we might offer some sensible psychological solutions to alleviate or help at least understand on a more in-depth level global challenges. And John alluded to some of the research my collaborators and I have been working on, these kind of applied problems over some time. Of course, like many other people, I've got a whole heap of COVID-19 projects and help people understand it going on with collaborators in Norway, looking at how young people understand climate change and respond to it. This large grant funded by the Carlsberg Foundation that has Angela Veal involved in as well, looking at cultural clashes and migration. And then inequalities, which has been the main source of my my research activities over the last decade. And this is what I want to turn to in part two of the talk. So issues to do with economic inequality. But first, I want to just say a few words on how do we do field social psychology. So to move from more the lofty theoretical kind of ideas of it, just to kind of see what it might look like in a more practical sense. So, in an older paper published in Perspectives in Psych Science, we proposed a SAGE model of social psychological sense. It's kind of WISE model of doing social psychology. The emphasis here is on the flexibility and synthesis between different forms of methods within a broader research project. And the idea here is that we can triangulate and get and use the best of each method rather than using them in isolation. So to use their strengths to overcome the weaknesses of other ones to create this triangulated view of a psychological phenomenon. And of course, this spans the use of qualitative and quantitative methodologies that can be used in conjunction together. And some of the research methods that I use and use with my collaborators, my PhD and postdoctoral students, we look at the move from naturalistic observation to participant observation to informal and semi-structured interviewing, as well as field experiments and lab experiments as well. So when it comes to SAGE, or rather now clunky acronym that I somewhat regret, but it's out there in the world, we're trying to look at how qualitative and quantitative methods can be used together. So we propose a synthetic model where qualitative methods are augmentative to quantitative methods, where qualitative methods are generative to new experimental hypotheses, but also where qualitative methods can be used to study experiences that evade psychological reductionism in this way. So this is an adjacent paper to the field social psychology paper with Joe Tennant, Ahmed Gaddafi, and Gabe Velez. But now I want to move from this kind of introduction of what field social psychology is in a theoretical, conceptual, and methodological way to what it's like to do field research, field social psychological research. And I've given many talks over the last maybe decade or so, but very rarely have I been invited to talk about this research to an Irish audience. So I'm curious to hear your responses and your questions after I present it. So my focus of this empirical part of my research is on the global financial crisis when it hit in 2008, and then when we have generally some sort of recoveries around the world, and including in the European Union and Ireland in particular, around 2016 and so on. So my work centered on what I later called the deprivation protest paradox, that when the economy collapsed in 2008, Irish people didn't take to the streets en masse to protest, by and large. But when the new tax on water, or charge on water, was introduced in 2014 in the context of aggregate economic growth, then you had people take to the streets. Then you had people protesting against their government and being upset with police and so on. So I did field research in this context to figure out what was going on from at least this descriptive paradox, and try and offer some sort of explanation from a cultural, social, psychological perspective. So I see this kind of paradox as a particular Irish case study that has kept me busy. My main research question are, what are people's psychological reactions to economic hardship? So I'm going to focus on this idea of fairness in the forthcoming analysis. I'm going to introduce some theorizing on fairness just to kind of guide you a little bit through the analysis and how I was making sense of my material. During the economic recession, I conducted 2 qualitative studies with a group of elites in Ireland, household names that I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, and a group of unemployed young people in Ireland. There's also some quantitative experimental evidence, but given the short nature of this talk, I'll skip over that, and maybe I can tell you a little bit more about it in the questions and answers. And then I'm going to say a few words about the drastic economic change in Waterford, or in Ireland, and the introduction of the water tax, and then my field social psychological research during the economic recovery. These 2 studies on protest movements that I conducted over the course of a year in Ireland. So drawing on some of my mentors and some of the people I've worked with when it comes to moral psychology and the cultural psychology of morality, John Haidt and Rick Schwader, we see from their types of research, ethnographic and experimental research, that a sense of fairness seems to be a universal moral principle. If we look at the biological, anthropological literature, we also see that fairness seems to be fundamental, not just in humans and in human society, but also across many different species. Paul Bloom tells us that it begins in childhood, and Mike Norton and Darren Ariely have convincing research evidence and experimental procedures to show that people think economic disparities are particularly unfair. And Alex Shaw at the University of Chicago tells us that even children, very young children, have an ingrained sense of economic fairness. So this is some of the literature that I was reading and drawing on across multiple different disciplines, using multiple different methods to kind of frame what Paul Rosen talks about sometimes as this informed curiosity. So you have these theoretical ideas and structures when you go into a research project to try and figure out what might be going on from a psychological point of view. But my initial research question was something a lot more basic. When the economy collapsed in Ireland, people seem to passively accept austerity, in contrast to the background photograph that you see here, lifted from a Greek protest in 2008, I think it was. The Irish response seemed to be far more muted. I just wanted to figure out why. So my idea was to talk to a group of people in Ireland who might know what was going on, this group of public elites who have a sense of these things. My justification for talking to these 20 people is that they were people who are responsible for circulating ideas in the public sphere about what was going on, the causes and consequences of the economic recession in Ireland and so on. So I developed a very rudimentary interview schedule, and I asked them about their causes, consequences, and solutions to an economic recession. Again, I felt quite naive going into these interviews in hindsight, but I performed a thematic analysis, and this is just a way of understanding from a qualitative analysis point of view, what people were saying in the course of these interviews. And they gave me 3 themes to explain from their point of view why Irish people in general were quite passive in accepting austerity, in contrast to some of its European Union neighbours that saw mass protest movements and even riots against agents of the state. So there's 3 themes embedded in this kind of collective memory literature in terms of how I wrote it up: of migration, social cohesion, and this provocative moral principle that in life you reap what you sow, that in life you get what you deserve. So I'm going to focus on the latter one of these just in terms of time. So this is a small interview extract from a very prominent financial, economic expert in the public eye in Ireland. He kind of tells me a little bit off the record. Obviously, all this was very anonymous and so on. I've never revealed who any of these people are. He tells me a little bit off the record He says to me, Seamus, I don't think any one participant can cause what happened in this country without the implicit approval of the people in it and the tacit approval of those who are not in it. So when people say, well, I was never part of it, referring to the Celtic Tiger, well, if you were here and you were getting impressive wage rises, you were taking the benefit of it, but you were just not playing the game at the table. So here he's kind of orientating to this common argument, well, I wasn't part of it, it was the elite bankers who got us into this trouble and so on. But he's saying that if you were in Ireland during the time of the boom years and things were good, of course the bubble burst and then we all reap what we sow, we all get what we deserve. And that's why people aren't protesting in Ireland, because people feel a bit silly, a bit ashamed that they were part of it too. And that's why there's no motivation to protest, according to this one respondent. So this, as part of an analysis, I wrote it up, of course, as an academic paper, but also wrote a series of op-eds in the Guardian newspaper and spoke about it a lot on radio, this kind of provocative moral concept that seemed to kind of add a different explanatory dimension to what was going on in Ireland, and it evoked, of course, as you might imagine, different forms of responses from different groups of people in Ireland. But it motivated a second study as well. So I obviously had spoken to an elite group of very wealthy and privileged people in Ireland. So I thought I'd interview a polar opposite group of unemployed young adults. Again, I interviewed 20 of them. But generally what my research with these young people showed is this internalization of the reap what you sow moral principle. I just want to focus on one extract with one young unemployed guy. We can call him John. I asked him in the course of an interview, who, if anyone, do you blame for the recession? John says, maybe he was early 20s. He says, you have to blame society in general, you know what I mean? There was just no exit plan. People just kept buying and selling and giving loans, and there's no expectation or realization that this was all going to break down. When the world recession kicked in and everyone is panicking and everyone is losing jobs, no one was expecting the highlights to end so suddenly and so abruptly. So you have to put blame on society. So I press him a little bit more. What do you mean by society? The Irish public, he says, without missing a heartbeat. And it's not just the Irish, I guess it's a world recession. But I think we were so naive to think that we will enjoy these moments, he tells me, without any plan for the future. My mother and father spent what they wanted. They got loans out. They would spend it and worry about it in the future. So here you see that although he's able to kind of conceptualize it as a global recession and so on, you see this kind of internalization that it's regular Irish people like his mum and dad who got loans out, that they were to blame. And this is another reason given by this group of young people, this kind of self-blame, this internalization of you get what you deserve in life, why they weren't angry with external agents like the government or the bank manager or the European Union in general, for example. So he goes on in the course of his interview to say how his dad now is under all this debt, that he's in treatment for clinical depression and so on. And they're from a very working class background. But even in that sense, they weren't angry externally. They're maybe holding it within in this particular way. So that was the early part of the work and revolving around this kind of moral, cultural psychology of you reap what you sow. But of course, things changed in around 2014. Emblematic here with Enda Kenny on the front of Time magazine to kind of an American audience saying, okay, we might have been sick, we took our medicine, now we have the green shoot of recovery. This Celtic comeback Ireland is once again open for business. You hear a lot of this narrative in the media internationally and domestically of economic recovery and so on. But that's not the only thing that was happening in Ireland. They had one story of aggregate objective economic growth. You also had the introduction of a new charge on water that regular people and lots of people in Ireland said has been particularly unfair. And again, this kind of idea of proportionality and fairness rather than some sort of equity and equality seems to be the psychological process underlying this. But people took to the streets when this water charge was introduced. So again, I thought this was curious. I had no sense when I was beginning this research of where it would end, but Chicago were very good to me. I had a year off from teaching and I could go to Ireland and do this type of field work. I did two types of projects. The first was going to the streets and mostly in Dublin, anywhere between 20 and 100,000 people, where I would do randomly sampled interviews and go on these marches and record politicians and activists who would speak at the end and so on. And I also spent time in a smaller Irish city following these groups of anti-water charge protesters who were trying to disrupt construction workers and so on. So I spent a year of ethnographic work following these people around as well. So here's just one example on one of the protests. A woman said to me, there's far too much austerity on ordinary people, she says, on ordinary working class people, and even middle income people are being crucified with high taxation, with motor tax, with petrol tax, with value added tax, everything. Everything you buy in this country, it's far too dear. It's far too expensive. So over the course of this year of field social psychological work, of ethnographic work, and so on, I interviewed maybe over 200 people. And then when you do this kind of analysis of what they're saying, it seems to circle around this kind of idea of unfairness. Of course, and obviously, people were upset with this new charge on water, as we've seen, the increased cost of living and taxes. But people, when you go and talk to them on protest, they devolve into all sorts of complaints about society and government and authority and so on. So people were also quite upset about the homeless crisis and the growing homeless crisis at the time. There was a sense that the in-power government at the time were not representing the people. There's perennial problems with the health service, and general and very strong sense, and something I articulated in a separate paper, that the police were on the side of corporations and not the public. And also, interestingly, there's a shift in the attribution to blame. So when I asked people, okay, some years ago in my earlier research, people weren't protesting, they had this kind of idea of blaming themselves. But now it's the government. People use this metaphor of we were asleep and now we're awake. When it's the government and even the police who should reap what they sow. So you get this kind of two-sided view of this moral principle of reap what you sow. It's not just internal, it can be externalized as well. So one prominent female left-wing politician in Ireland said at one of the speeches at the end of the water protests, "Let no one be in any doubt that our demand will be an end to water charges into Irish water, and a beginning of society based on equality, decency and fairness and full citizenship for every single one of us. And that means a roof over every citizen's head, and that means decent work and a decent chance and fair taxation." So what can we learn from the field social psychological viewpoint from this particular Irish case that's located obviously within one cultural context in relation to one phenomenon of inequality and one period of time that has now passed? What are kind of broader lessons we can learn from this form of local knowledge? So we learn first, perhaps, that we can theorize from local knowledge. We might learn, in contrast to behavioral economics or evolutionary psychological predictions, that people tolerate economic hardship even during a recession when they consider it to be fair. That when economic hardship is deemed unfair, even during periods of stark economic growth, social movements can develop. And perceptions of what is and is not fair modulate whether people tolerate growing economic inequalities and hardship or not. And why, you might ask, is any of this important? For our audiences, perhaps outside of the local context, it allows us to understand unfolding social political phenomena as the unfolding of the Irish water protests is just one example. We can also use findings from these local cases to understand other global events. And now I'm starting to, over the last number of years, research and take interest in other cultural contexts where you see a similar dynamic. For example, in Occupy Wall Street occurred in 2011 when there was an economic recovery going on in the US, not in 2007 when Lehman Brothers collapsed. So things were getting better, but unfairly so, with a gap between the 1% and the 99%. Looking at protests more recently, we see exactly the same dynamic going on in the French context, like in Ireland where they introduced a charge on water, and France increased the charge of fuel. In the context of an economic recovery. So you see people thinking this is unfair. They're hearing a narrative of things improving on aggregate in the country, but they're regular working people being hit with a new tax. You see it in South America too, in Chile, in the same economic circumstances of aggregate economic growth, where the government introduced a new charge on subways that affected workers and young students. And you see it too in Sudan in 2019 and 2020, where the government introduced new taxes and charges on both fuel and bread that drove this broader revolution, again in the context of growing GDP and growing GNP. So some of this, for those maybe more seasoned than the third year students, this might feel a little bit like relative deprivation theory, this idea from Sam Stuffler, his famous series of books on promotions in the American Army. And he says that when an individual or group compares themselves to salient other individuals or groups and finds themselves lacking or discriminated against, and this leads to angry frustration. So this is also in my mind as kind of sensitizing concept or informed curiosity when I was trying to make sense of my interviews and what was going on in this Irish case. But from a field social psychological perspective, I ended up delving a little bit deeper and thinking about the theoretical consequences of this in-depth ethnographic work in Ireland for relative deprivation theory. And I think really it needs some modification, especially when it comes to who compares who to whom. So my PhD student, Thomas Massett, and my collaborator in the office next door, Tom Morton, we wrote a little paper looking at who compares who to whom and focusing on three different areas: the idea of technology, how technology is altering subjective experiences of what groups of people and individuals are comparing themselves to who in this globalized world. So the comparison groups are not local, they're now global. Of course, on my mind from moving to Copenhagen are who are the 1% here in Copenhagen, our PhD students. If you do some basic math, are in the top global percent of income earners. So kind of critically questioning who are the 1% and what that means to have this particular category of income. And also I'm interested in temporal comparisons, how people are thinking about time, how they're thinking about the past, the present and future, and when they're comparing who to whom, which might motivate protests, might motivate feelings of unfairness or not. So I've been thinking about this Irish case study within these two broader narratives of economic inequality. So I'm going to show, you can see one graph here in the next slide, there'll be one more graph as well. So this first graph is a way of perhaps situating what was happening in what I've seen in Ireland from an ethnographic field, social psychological point of view, from the famous book by Piketty, the French historical economist. And really what's important here is to look at from the 1970s, that basically it shows that in Europe and the USA, that the rich are getting richer from the 1970s. And this is something we hear a lot about. So this kind of 1% are pulling away from the 99% that, the rich and the super rich are leaving us all in their wake. So this is one narrative of economic inequality that's kind of used by politicians and highlighted by politicians and people generally on the left and liberal people to say that this is really unfair, we should be really upset about this and so on. And then in contrast, there's a second narrative of economic development that I spend also a lot of time thinking about. So here we can see from the year 0 to the year 2001, aggregate gains in the global floor of wealth and global floor of income. So you can see that for most of human history, most people in the world were incredibly poor in terms of wealth and, of course, access to related services and health and education and so on. But you see with the advent of industrialization in the 1800s, you see in Western Europe, particularly in England, this kind of aggregate increase of wealth and then associated income and access to goods and services. So it kind of provides a second narrative of economic growth that kind of stands in juxtaposition to the second narrative. So I've been thinking about this kind of Irish case study, and maybe if there's other case studies in Sudan, in Chile, and in France and the United States, as I've indicated with the previous pictures, how people are locating themselves within historical time, whether they see this first narrative of economic inequality from the 1970s, or whether people are looking at a more historical time period, and which narrative do we buy into? This kind of the rich getting richer kind of narrative, or okay, there's inequality, but the global floor is increasing for everyone at this time. So I've been trying to locate these different case studies within this kind of broader historical and cultural economic analysis. But briefly, just to conclude in the final slide, I want to return to field social psychology that I've spoken about and talk about its potential to really expand the social psychological paradigm. I think field social psychology and this Irish case study is just one example of it. I think a lot can be said for theory generation and elaboration. I've kind of hinted at some of the kind of what I think are exciting theoretical developments that come from field social psychology. You've seen in my talk that I've articulated this reap what you sow idea, this idea of the cultural psychology of moral thinking, perhaps within the Irish domain. You can see how I've developed relative deprivation theory by looking at what's local and global in terms of comparisons and so on. I think it's something so important and something I learned very well in UCC as an undergrad, this idea of methodological integration, of how we can use different methods in combination is incredibly useful and powerful, and something I'm sure all the students in UCC continue to learn, the importance of flexibility with methods and the ecological validity behind them, I think is very important. And then in terms of my view on field social psychology and my interest in protests and social movements and so on, we can understand, at least to some degree, if not ultimately predict. I don't think that might be possible, but maybe we can understand when protests will occur in neoliberal economic context. And for me, I think the future of field social psychology, I'd really argue somewhat strongly for the re-expansion of the social psychological paradigm, and less strongly, I would say that we need to creatively engage with pressing global issues to be able to say something about them, to understand them, to describe them and document them before we can try to solve them in any meaningful way. So that's me. Thanks so much for your attention. I really appreciate it. Of course, I think we have a little bit of time for some questions and answers as well. So thank you so much.
Thanks a million, Seamus.
Right, thank you.
Thanks a million, Seamus. Really interesting stuff. So in terms of the questions, then we'll have to coordinate this. So if anyone online has a question, you can use the raise hand function, and we'll kind of get to you in turn. You can alternatively type a question into the chat, or if anyone in the room there has a question, I suppose Sarah, you could just raise your hand, I suppose. I think that's probably the best way of doing it. So yeah, does anyone have a question there for Seamus to start us off? John has a question. Great.
Great talk, Seamus. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks, John.
I was waiting for neoliberalism, and it came on the very last slide. Brilliant.
Mm-hmm.
A couple of things, and I have a list of scribbles here on field social psychology and on the actual case study. So I think this might be a conversation that it would be good to continue separately, over the weeks and months to come and what have you. But in field social psychology, sounds really interesting, and I really love the contrast with Lewin's work. I was wondering how far you could push it. So participant observation and kind of slightly participatory social psychology is kind of like the acceptable face in a way. There's a step beyond that, I think, which is a much more participative model of research, which partly because it is so applied, the kind of work that people like Connor and Sarah, either side of you on my screen, do in HCI, is very comfortable with a notion of participatory research, where communities might define the questions and might also help with the analysis or do the analysis, and the kind of specialization and power, if you like, that's attached to a profession like psychology or researcher is never taken out of it. I wouldn't pretend that, but is played down at least. Is that gone too far for social psychology?
Great question, lovely observations. Actually, I have a paper currently under review making some of these points with Angela Veal, one of the co-authors, Alex Gillespie, Tanya Zidane, the kind of maybe the who's who of this kind of perspective in psychology, called Social Psychology of and for World Making, which is meant to be, at least from my point of view, the next step of field social psychology. So it's under review at the moment. So hopefully we'll get some generous people. But I mean, I think for me, that's the kind of braver, newer step for social psychology in that way. I guess, I mean, that paper that I'm talking about is with maybe 15 people in total. So of course there's different tensions between people, and you see different people who have different degrees of support for this kind of interventionist community research, action research, and so on. I'm the lead on that paper. I guess coming from an American context, when I started drafting it, at least originally, I was somewhat reluctant to have an interventionist, we have the best way, this is how it is, we have to, as psychologists, get into a community, okay, we'll work with them and we'll improve something. I guess there's an awful lot of that in the American context, and I think sometimes slowing down is a good thing. Taking your time is a good thing. So that's why I do advocate the naturalistic and participant observation as very base methods, but incredibly fundamental methods. So I do think there's a huge place in psychology, and I think it's already happening. I don't think people are critically reflecting on it so much as this kind of social psychology of and for world making. I think the first step is field, and I think there's bigger debates to have about community and action research and, issues to do with power. I think, yeah, you can downplay them, but I don't think you can ever downplay them. Maybe it just takes a different form and so on. So I'm a little skeptical about advocating for interventionist type research. I mean, you might have heard me say I like to document and describe and examine, and then perhaps there's a solution or some policy that you might advocate for. But that grows out of my 7 years in Chicago, where everyone had the best idea to solve all the problems. And, so a little reaction to that is where I'm currently at, I guess, in my own thinking and theorizing. But great question, John. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. Sarah Robinson. Sarah, you're on mute there.
Sorry, I should know this 2 years into it. Thanks, Seamus. Really interesting talk, and I followed your work and find it really interesting. I, similarly to John, I was interested that neoliberal kind of came on the last slide, and I'm interested in this idea of, you talk about the internalization of reap what you can sow. And I know you're also working in other cultural contexts at the moment, but for me, that seems like a neoliberal self. Like, it seems like the Irish people have internalized neoliberalism more so than other neoliberal contexts in Europe. And I was just wondering if your research has kind of explored that. And the other thing, just in my own research, I've been interested in the response to Tuam babies and kind of baby homes. And I've been looking at kind of letters to the editors kind of at various different stages. And one of the main kind of repertoires that comes up is around collective responsibility. And that's used in different ways. So one of the ways it's used is to kind of silence and to say, shut up, lads, we were all involved, and the action orientation is kind of one of preventing justice and accountability and all of those things. But then it's used in another way to kind of advocate for that. So I was just wondering, obviously you did a thematic analysis, but if you were to go back to that data and look at it discursively, do you have a sense at the moment of the different ways that trope is used and how it opens up or shuts down social action?
Yeah, I mean, that's super interesting. And of course, I followed your work as well for some time too. I did think my initial PhD proposal was to get into the reap what you sow idea, the moral psychology of this, and a lot more in depth, because it got a lot of attention at the start and so on. But then, of course, people started protesting. So I've kind of shifted that idea, but I did have some thoughts. Is it like from Irish Catholicism, this kind of cultural way of thinking and so on, that one blames themselves, or austerity is like penance, and, like this kind of ingrained Catholicism in some way. So I had some thoughts on this and some ideas and so on. Was there a more punitive form of Catholicism in Ireland that's different from Catholicism that might be more forgiving in Italy and Spain. And so I did play with that, but people took to the streets. I had a year off. I came to Ireland and followed the protest. So it's a very practical swing like this, which is why maybe in field social psychology, I think a lot about the flexibility of methods and this kind of process ontology underlying it all, that maybe you follow your nose a little bit for better or worse. So that research never got done, but I did have at least some rudimentary ideas. In terms of recoding and looking back at this, practically again, I don't think I have time. If I did have time, I mean, I think in general, people thought it added something. I think it added something to the conversation, that reap what you sow, because it was, people whispered it. People would say, you know, this is fully anonymous, right? Or like, you know, I'd never say this on TV because I'd get my, you know, fired or get my hands chopped off, or, you know, whatever. But I think a lot of people were saying it, and a lot of people in power in the Irish media and in finance and politics, these people I interviewed are people everyone would know, presumably, by reputation, but they didn't want to say it out loud. So I think on that level, the fact that it was so hush-hush and so on revealed how this particular group were thinking about it. I mean, I think the migration, social cohesion stuff explains some degree why Irish people didn't take to the streets. There wasn't this kind of build up of young people, you know, people are Australia, America, and so on. But the reprieve, so I think it was nice, but I haven't delved into it discursively in this way yet. And maybe at some point in my career I will, but we'll see.
Can I say,
great question. Yeah,
yeah. Last thing before you get to Sarah. I just wondered whether there's something about us being an island. So we've been writing about islandness and from the West Cork Islands and kind of the need to keep the peace, which I know you talk about in your work. But maybe the kind of islandness is maybe the difference between, I don't know, Ireland and Greece, for example.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I have been thinking that. I think that's great. There's a nice book by Aaron Norenzyne, who's one of the authors on the Weird paper that you might know. He's got a book called Big Gods, and explaining from a kind of a geographic evolutionary point of view why people believe in different forms of gods. So I was thinking of this harsh island adrift in the Atlantic. We might have developed some sort of punitive gods to explain what was going on in the hardship of Ireland. And obviously just speculating wildly at this moment, but I had some thoughts about this, but fantastic. Maybe I'll return to it. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Yes, super interesting questions. I think this will have to be the last one though, because Sarah, you need to get out of that room so that, because there's another class after you. Yeah.
Okay, I'll ask a very quick question if that's okay.
It doesn't have to be quick, but yeah, we do need to. We've got another 3 or 4 minutes probably. Yeah. Thanks.
In time. Thank you, Seamus. Really fascinating work. I remembered or recalled the Irish water uproar during last week when I was listening to people on the radio talking about petrol prices and fuel increases, and it was the first time I really thought, okay, there's I remember the kind of response to Irish water that I didn't really think about during COVID, for example. And I'm wondering, in your research or your interviews, is there anything about remembering or collective memory of those kind of unique responses that has an impact on how people respond when similar kind of things catch the public perspective as well?
Yeah, well, certainly I will say when I interviewed the group of elites, that paper is written up in the collective memory literature, right? Bartlett and Halwex and these types of people, how people are using the past to inform their answers in the present and get orientated and so on. So I think there's a whole bunch of that going on. And when I interviewed these young unemployed people as well, they drew on these kind of some form of collective memory and individual memories of like, oh, we never protested before, so it's not really what's done here. I don't want to, you know, shake the boat in this way, right? So people are definitely using the past very actively in this way, both the elites in one form of memory and then the unemployed people in another form. But interesting, you mentioned this about the fuel hike in Ireland. I had a conversation with one of my elite, quote unquote, informants just last week. And he had said something that they're maybe bracing themselves for protests within Irish government based on this as well. It's that type of thing that people get quite annoyed about, right? It's something you can hang your hat on, right? It's a water charge, it's a fuel hike. We see in Sudan, it's bread, it's fuel in France, and you know, so these types of obvious symbols that people can galvanize around. So if there's any kind of prediction that one could make, from my type of work. It's like when there's an obvious symbol that people can galvanize around, it tends to maybe lead to protest. But yeah, great question. It's really nice to have some time to think about this, and especially with an audience or people living in Ireland as well. So it's been a while since I've had an opportunity to present. So thanks everyone so much for having me and for having these questions as well. I really appreciate it.
Great, and thanks again, Seamus. So a round of applause there if anyone's still there. And yeah, absolutely, just so much to think about for all of us. I think really inspiring talk. And you know, I'm sure we'll all kind of go away and scratch our heads about that, and hopefully kind of think things through a bit better afterwards. And definitely brilliant fuel for a general paper for the final years there. Okay, so thanks again, Seamus. Really interesting stuff, and we'll have to kind of leave it at that.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much. All the best. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.